Hi, and welcome to this session on how to analyze economic risks. Today, that's what we want to understand and want to learn. What is economic risks? How do they come into your Web3 protocol? And why should you care about that? So before we begin, just want to give a quick agenda of what we're going to go through in this session. We talk about economic sustainability and stability analysis. The whole thing about defining risk and uncovering risk is to understand how stable or how volatile the system is. So how should you go about figuring this thing out? And lastly, how can you learn more about designing economics? So with that, let's begin. You should care about the economic sustainability of this economy, of this ecosystem. And what you want to care about, you want to think about, does this economy evolve its own structure to balance between long-term and short-term sustainability? Short-term profits, long-term sustainability. As a user, I want to make sure that this economy will continue to exist in the next 5 years because I want to use it. So I want to care about the economic sustainability. Does the economic rules allow the economic sustainability to flourish? Are there different kind of economic risks involved? The second type will be your VCs and investors. Here, you should care about the self-financing ability of this ecosystem. Can the token economy grow and develop and ultimately sustaining the entire growth of the economy purely just by retained earnings from the ecosystem? Again, this comes from an investors and VCs perspective. If you're constantly pumping money in for the ecosystem and economy to be sustainable, that is not going to be a sustainable economy. There's going to be pretty high risk, high economic risk. From that perspective, start thinking about the different ways to look at economic risks. Here you can think a little bit more about the financial risk aspects, but also remember, how do we implement them? How do we change them? How do we shape the right kind of financial system, financial models in the system? And lastly, most importantly, it's a protocol creators and decision makers. Here, you care about the organization and hierarchical system within your ecosystem because everything we're moving towards is decentralization. Maybe not 100% decentralization, but you're going to decentralize some stuff. So what is the organization looking like? What is the hierarchy looking like? Can the economy optimally balance between the various value flows within and across the subsystem to maintain economic viability? That's going to be key. As you give up more economic power towards decentralization, what are the economic risks in place? Is it still going to be self-sustaining, self-financing, and self-organizing in the system? So that's another perspective of risk to think about. And we look at these three different core market participants to create the various kind of risks in place. Okay, now I've given you the background, given you the different types of things to think about. I want to share some answers with you. What are the different risks categories that we have figured out? And I want you to start thinking about them in those areas. Again, because they're not always relevant to all protocols in the space. Something that's relevant to Chainlink might not be relevant to X Infinity. Something that's relevant to X Infinity might not be relevant to MakerDAO. So they're very different, but they're the categories that we can start brainstorming and thinking about. So for risks, for economic risks, we divide into two: systemic risks and idiosyncratic risks. You have that in the financial market. You know, nothing is new. A lot of things we get inspired from the current markets that we live in. Systemic risks are things that you cannot control. It's from the big system. The macro picture, the big system, things that you cannot control. Here, we look at the macro market. If the world is going through recession, high inflation, stagnation, there is nothing that you as a DeFi protocol or GameFi protocol can do. But of course, you can make different changes to your system to reflect or reduce the various risks in place, but changing the protocol doesn't change the entire market and resolve everything. So that's in systemic risk, we have number one, the market risk, the macro market. Second, the user risks. This will be a bit more of the user behavior. Sure, we can influence user behavior, we can incentivize certain behaviors, but we can't control that. If we can control that, that's quite a dystopian world that we live in. So we can influence these behaviors, but we can't control that. So that's one of the risks in place. And thirdly is the technical risks. As I mentioned, say we're building on another protocol that you don't have any control of. Or maybe everything is running on AWS cloud and you don't have control over that. So you can figure out ways to mitigate the risks, but you don't have any control over that. So you can't change them in the economics design of your system. So those are systemic risks. It's good to quantify them. I would say that from an investor's perspective, it's better to figure that out. But the cool thing, the fun thing that we want to look at are the idiosyncratic risks. Idiosyncratic risks are things that you can control. You can design them and update the design in the economics of your ecosystem. And here we have 5 different areas. First one is the protocol. Second, the economic parameters. Economic parameters will be the design that we talked about. Protocol is the core business, almost like the token business model we're talking about. Third is your governance structure. How do you make decisions? How do you decentralize the decisions? How do you punish bad behaviors? How do you execute all these decisions? Your financial risks. So how does the token accrue value so that it's self-financing? And your liquidity risks. So how do you allow for enough liquidity in the secondary market or the primary market to allow for transactions to happen, especially if your token is a medium of exchange to allow for exchange to happen. So these are the 8 key risks that we look at. We have systemic and idiosyncratic. Within them, we have market, user, and technological risks. For systemic, in idiosyncratic, we look at protocol, economic parameter, governance, financial, and liquidity risks. Together, we have 8 different kinds of risks that we look at when we quantify economic risks. Once we can quantify that, once we can measure that, then we can change and improve, and then measure the improvement from there. When we can measure, we can improve. And that's what all of us are talking about. There is no one-size-fits-all model. It's all about improvement, iteration. Once the market changes, the mechanism will change and the tokens need to be updated. So how do we measure that? How do we make changes? The good thing about Web3 is that you've got data availability. Fantastic, beautiful. Now we need to use data for something. And we need to use the data for good. We need to use the data to make good changes and improvements to the protocol itself, so that it becomes self-sustaining, self-financing, and self-organizing. That's what we want to do. We want to create very robust and sustainable economic systems so that people like you and me can continuously use this protocol, and not that in 3 months and 3 years, the protocol just disappears. We're creating lasting systems that last for a long time, that's sustainable, that's robust. So hopefully that gives you some ideas and starting points and some answers to figure out how do we calculate and analyze economic risks in the system. I want you to start having this conversation in all the meetings that you have, because economic risk is something that's so important. If your economy is completely flawed, you can have good financial risk management and good smart contract audit to execute them. But if your economy is not sustainable, it's going to disappear in 6 to 12 months, then why do we need to care about all the other things? If we don't get economic sustainability right, nothing else matters. And I want you to start having this conversation because the space is mature enough to start having this conversation. How do we look at economic risks? How do we do token due diligence? What is token due diligence? How do we do economic assurance? How do we do economic audit? This is a conversation we need to start to have. I'm Lisa, the founder of Economics Design, and we design economics of the system. We want to share a lot of the knowledge that we have learned throughout all the consulting, throughout all the research that we have, so that you don't make the mistakes that we have done, and we can grow this entire space together. And we can really use blockchain and DLT to make the future a better place. Hopefully that answers a lot of your questions. Until then, I'll see you next time. Bye!